benefit. So let's talk about toxic exposure, and we're going to kind of do this in two different prongs. First, let's talk about Agent Orange, and let's really get into what is Agent Orange, when was it used, and where, and why?
Agent Orange is a chemical defoliant that was used by DOD in the military, specifically in Vietnam and during the Vietnam era. Agent Orange also, for VA purposes and DOD purposes, covers a myriad of the rainbow of agents or chemical defoliants that contain harmful dioxins, which eventually have led to being associated to diseases in veterans who were exposed. Primary area that Agent Orange was used was in country Vietnam. It's being recognized there for the whole era of Vietnam service from 62 to 75. And just recently, legislation has passed that allows veterans who served in the waters offshore, or what is commonly referred to as Blue Water Navy, allows those who have served in some locations within 12 nautical miles of the shore and some locations up to 80 nautical miles of shore, conceding that they were now also considered exposed to Agent Orange as well.
So we're talking about, with the Blue Water Navy veterans, these are sailors, Marines, other service members who were serving in ships off the coast of Vietnam during the conflict, but did not set foot on ground. Why would plants need to be defoliated? What was the advantage here? Why was it used in the first place?
Well, they referred to it as tactical herbicides, and it was their way of destroying the vegetation so they could have a clearer picture of, or better understanding of, the battlefield, the lay of the land when it came to combat within Vietnam. So they were trying to destroy a lot of the vegetation just so it was easier to find and locate the enemy, as well as make it more difficult for them to hide.
And so this stuff got sprayed all over the country, and now we know that troops and service members on the ships were exposed. What types of diseases are associated with long-term Agent Orange exposure? What is the long-term health consequences of being exposed to these toxic chemicals?
The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have been studying Agent Orange and the long-term effects since '94, and the VA has recognized 14 separate diseases that also include a whole variety of soft tissue sarcomas, which is a very specific type of cancers, as well as ischemic heart disease, diabetes, prostate cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and a few other more rare diseases that have been associated to Agent Orange specifically.
And a lot of these diseases don't show up sometimes decades later, in fact. So you got exposed in the late 60s, maybe in the 70s or earlier, and these diseases didn't show up, they're showing up now when Vietnam veterans are in their 60s and 70s and they're looking to get their benefits.
Right, and that's the whole purpose of those studies, and they were doing them every 2 years for a very long period of time because, as you noted, when veterans have aged, that's when a lot of these diseases are starting to show after that long-term exposure, and in most cases they don't show up while they're still on active military service, or even within a year or two. It's generally many years later based on that exposure.
Now, there are 14 of these diseases that are associated with exposure with Agent Orange, but there's been some recent legislation or some recent push in our government to expand that list of diseases. Where do we stand on that?
In 2016, the National Academy of Medicine released their 2014 report indicating that 2 diseases needed to be elevated to what they refer to limited or suggestive evidence of association to Agent Orange. And those 2 diseases are bladder cancer and hypothyroidism. That report also indicated that Parkinson's-like syndromes or symptoms should be considered part of the already recognized Parkinson's disease. So those 3 diseases were specifically mentioned in 2016. Now we're in January 2020, and they still have not added those 3 disabilities to the presumptive list. It's up to the Secretary of the VA to make those determinations and to add those as additional presumptive diseases, or it's also ultimately Congress can pass legislation to add those diseases as well. Right now, there is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of discussion about adding these diseases because nothing has happened in over 3 years. There is current legislation that has been recently introduced that would add these, and the Secretary recently released a letter stating that they were waiting on 2 additional studies that the VA was conducting themselves in reference to Vietnam-era veterans, that they were going to wait for the outcome of those potentially not until the end of 2020 before they make a decision. So it appears they're dragging this out potentially another year. Now, the fourth disease is hypertension. In 2006, the National Academies of Science recommended hypertension to be classified as limited or suggestive evidence of an association with Agent Orange. Subsequently, the VA did their own study saying they didn't believe it was related. However, most recently in the 2018 report from the National Academies, they have elevated to sufficient evidence of hypertension associated with Agent Orange exposure. And that's been pending over a year and a few months now, and still no action on adding hypertension either.
And in fact, the Blue Water Navy veterans, that they are just now in this year being able to submit their claims. Is that correct?
Yes. The law was signed last June, and in July, the VA placed a stay on those cases until the law went into effect, which was January 1st of 2020. And the VA has received, I believe, over 10,000 claims, and they're processing them right now. They've already made some decisions.
Wow.
So if a veteran does have a disability that they believe is related to Agent Orange and they were serving in the waters offshore of Vietnam, they need to establish a claim now.
Now let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about burn pits. Now, I've heard that burn pits may be the Agent Orange of the post 9/11 generation. And so what are burn pits? When were they used and why? It kind of, the term burn pit conjures images of massive fires in the middle of the desert in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And that's essentially what they were. The burn pits were used as a tactical decision by DOD to make sure that they're destroying any of their equipment, anything that they had with them, so the enemy could never use anything that was thrown away or anything that was considered waste. Some of these burn pits were burning everything from unexploded ordnance to human feces to medical waste to solvents, chemicals, paints, IT equipment, computers, anything that they didn't want to be lasting behind. They had to find a way to destroy that. And this is a tactical decision DOD has been using for years. However, they were very prominent during Iraq and Afghanistan and at Djibouti, and even prior to post 9/11 during the first Persian Gulf, they were widely used as a way to eliminate and get rid of anything they had with them. Some of these burn pits at some locations were even over around 10 acres large. I mean, that's how big some of these burn pits were. And based on the size of the base or the location or the forward operating base, some of these never stopped burning. So they were consistently smoldering and burning on a 24-hour basis. And it really wouldn't matter where you were on that base or that forward operating base, because that volume of burning, smoke, chemicals, things in the air, the way the winds shift and turn, if you're on that installation or on that base, you're going to be exposed to everything that's being burned and emitted in the air.
And all these chemicals being released into the air, as we said, and of course the troops are breathing them in. And I think the link between Agent Orange and burn pits is these people were exposed, in the past 20 years, a little less than that. And so we really will not see the long-term health consequences of burn pits until these veterans turn in their 60s or 70s, perhaps. And you've been spearheading some legislation on concession of burn pits exposure. Can you talk a little bit about where that bill is now and what it would do, and is it going to become law?
Well, just to give a brief amount of background in reference to that, the long-term health effects of being exposed to burn pits, the National Academies of Sciences, they released a report in 2011 that essentially said they weren't sure. They were inconclusive results on whether there were any specific diseases related to burn pit exposure. With that being said, they are conducting another study right now that may not be completed until the end of this year and end of next year. So sometimes, it can take years and years and years before these diseases creep up. So do we want to wait until these veterans are in their 50s and 60s before we can add these presumptive conditions or find a way to link them to that exposure and have them suffer 20 or 30 years? And the answer is no. We don't want to have to wait until we get the science in order for them to start getting benefits now. So the idea that DAV has pushing that originated with us last year is the concept of a concession of exposure. Essentially, if you were in a location that had active burn pits, the VA would concede you were exposed to burn pits, and more importantly, they would concede the toxins and chemicals you were actually exposed to. Right now, the VA in their adjudication manual have a list of those toxins and chemicals that they concede in certain cases. What we're suggesting with the concept of a concession of exposure is that, one, if a veteran did serve in an area that had active burn pits, they're automatically considered exposed, and two, automatically considered exposed to those same list of chemicals. And three, when they submit their claim, if there's insufficient evidence to grant, the VA then would have to provide a medical opinion based on that exposure if the disease they're claiming is at least as likely as not related. So while this isn't a presumptive in a set of diseases because we don't have that information yet, this is a way to help veterans establish a direct service-connected claim based on that exposure without having us to wait another 3 years, 5 years, 10 years before we have the science to link these conditions to that exposure. This idea was introduced by Senators Sullivan and Manchin in the Senate in November.
A Democrat and a Republican.
So we have bipartisan support. It is Senate Bill 2950. And currently we are in discussions with the House of Representatives Veterans Affairs Committee for them to introduce it within the House, because as you know, we need to get the bill passed in the House and the Senate in order for it to become law. And the way it looks, there's a lot of support in the Senate right now for it, and it looks like there's a lot of support in the House. So we're very hopeful there'll be some upcoming hearings this year to discuss this concept and this issue. I know there's going to be some major pushes coming up later in February to really get this information out. We're very optimistic, but again, you never know what's going to happen within the House or the Senate. The Senate is undergoing, Senate Veterans Affairs Committee is going under a change of leadership this year. The former Chair, Senator Johnny Isakson, retired, and the new chairman, which is Senator Jerry Moran out of Kansas, he's taking over the committee, and I know this is an issue he is very much wanting to push. So we're very optimistic about the chances of the idea of concession of exposure being passed into law yet this year, because the end of December of this year will end this the 116th Congress, so we have until December to get it passed.
Okay. And of course, the VA has this burn pit registry, which if you were a loved one was deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan since 9/11, you can put your name on this registry, and that's kind of a way the VA is trying to almost like establish a science and to kind of have a long-term project to see what health consequences can be gleaned from this. And I know if you were exposed, or if you think you were exposed to burn pits, or if you deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Djibouti, any of these places where they had active burn pits since 9/11, you should definitely type in the VA burn pit registry into Google and add your name. I myself, an Iraq War veteran, I'm on the burn pit registry.
And it's also available to veterans who served during the first Persian Gulf as well. So if you served in 1990 in that area in Southwest Asia, you should also sign yourself up for the burn pit registry. And originally it was just a self-reporting system to where you just go in and you verify your dates and where you served, and then you report your symptoms. However, now they have the option to where you can request an examination from a doctor, and they will examine you and then keep all of that information in the registry as well. And as you noted, they can use all of this information for future studies to determine if there's any similarities or commonalities within the veteran population for their health effects with that exposure.
And if anyone was exposed, or if they think they were exposed to either Agent Orange or burn pits, what should they do?
Well, the registry is a great place to start. There's also an Agent Orange registry as well. That is generally something you have to do through the VA Medical Center. You have to go and ask about the registry there, and they'll give you an exam and put all your information in the system. So signing up for the registries is always a great start. However, that does not initiate a claim for benefits. So if you have a disability that you believed is related to either of those exposures, or it's one of the presumptive diseases for Agent Orange, then yes, you need to contact a service officer. You should seek out somebody's assistance to help you do it. DAV has service officers around the country that are very well versed and trained, and they can help guide you through that process, or they can contact the VA directly and establish a claim as well.
We also have a resource page on toxic exposure where it goes into all this into much more detail. Shane, thank you very much for being with me here today.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Matt. It was a good time.
Great information there by Shane and Matt. We appreciate them for that. In a little bit, we're going to hear more on how you can make some claims around toxic exposure. But up first, we're going to talk about Mefloquine, a pill taken weekly. It was developed in the 1960s and 70s by the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research after a drug-resistant strain of malaria sickened troops in Vietnam. It was widely prescribed to U.S. service members from 1989 when it was approved by the Food and Drug Administration until 2009 when the DoD issued directives making it a last choice drug for troops. This was despite the known risk and varying long-term effects. Dr. Remington Nevin, an expert and former Army preventative medicine officer who was authorized more than 30 scientific publications on malaria and anti-malarial medication, sat down with DAV's Todd Hunter to talk more about some of the Mefloquine miscues.
Yeah, so thanks for taking the time. Were you at Bagram at the same time?
Yeah, I think we flew over from Bragg in early 2007. I was at the Jock. So it was our shop that was setting anti-malarial policy. It was that had decided Mefloquine would be the drug of choice on that deployment. And of course, it's kind of silly. We're taking Mefloquine in January at Bagram. There's absolutely zero malaria risk. But the thinking at the time was that, well, Mefloquine was so safe and we have so many people and we might as well just tell them to start taking it now so that when the mosquitoes do start biting in April or May or whenever, that people will be protected. It really is quite shocking how much faith we had in the safety of this drug despite everything that had been known about it. I realized that we had made a tremendous mistake in trusting the drug so much and using it as recklessly as we had. I've been surprised, going on now close to 15 years, right, since then, just how dangerous this drug is. And I think I'll probably be surprised when the final accounting is done just how many people have been affected by it. It's very likely single-digit percentages of people that took the drug, even briefly, that have suffered some degree of disability from it. And it's really a hidden epidemic because so few people still attribute these problems to the drug. There's always something else they attribute it to because it's taken during deployment when there's so many other things going on.
I want to ask you, though, you talked about putting our faith in the military, putting their faith into this drug.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me a little bit about, were there issues that popped up during the FDA approval process? Was there, sufficient evidence that should have kept it from coming to market?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, here's the fundamental problem with Mefloquine. So it was recognized around the time of its U.S. licensing that there were very significant problems with this drug. That in some people the drug could cause these neuropsychiatric effects. And at the time, it was appreciated just how serious these effects could be in terms of causing lasting disability. It was clearly known in 1989 when the drug was licensed that some people became psychotic, some people became very violent, and the dangers of the drug were such that the drug company, Roche, and the FDA both agreed to language in the product insert that said, while taking this drug for prevention of malaria, the way the military was planning to use the drug, if you develop anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, these must be considered prodromal to a, quote, more serious event, and the drug must be immediately discontinued. So what they were recognizing was that there were some people, for whatever reason, that had this extraordinary susceptibility or sensitivity to the drug. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't identify ahead of time who was susceptible to the drug's psychiatric effects and who wasn't. We knew many people could take it just fine. They seem to have no problem with it, but a sizable minority, or a minority at least, were susceptible. And so the solution that the FDA and Roche came up with was to add this language. But if you think about it, Todd, a drug that was developed for military use that's going to be given to people deploying to remote areas to protect them from malaria. Mm-hmm. And often these folks are going to be away from medical care. They're not going to be able to access medical care to get a resupply of a drug or a new drug. They're already going to be stressed. They're already going to be anxious. They're going to be crossing time zones. They'll be tired. They'll be restless just by nature of what they're doing. To give them a drug whose product insert says, in order to avoid a more serious event, you must discontinue this drug and replace it with another drug if you develop anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion. That makes no sense. The drug was fundamentally defective from the moment it became available in the United States with that language.
Think of pairing what you just said with the fact that these are young 19, 20-year-old guys in a combat zone for the first time. Like, what do you attribute where during that time?
Exactly. And we knew, even back then, we knew that service members don't report psychiatric symptoms. This is well known.
Yeah.
So the real problem with this drug goes back to the decision of the U.S. military to continue to use the drug after the drug company and the FDA mandated this language in the product insert that you must stop the drug if you develop these symptoms. And really the big failure with Mefloquine all along has been a failure to acknowledge these warnings and to use the drug in a manner that's consistent with these warnings. So are there some people who could take the drug in a reasonably safe manner? Sure. You might have some senior officer who has experience with Mefloquine, who's going on a fairly benign deployment overseas, and they can take Mefloquine for maybe 2 to 3 weeks before they deploy. They can see if they have any problems with the drug. They can go back to their doctor and be assessed one final time before going overseas. And if it looks like they've taken 3 to 4 doses of Mefloquine and they seem to be doing just fine, no nightmares, no insomnia, no change in personality, no dizziness, no ringing in the ears, then it looks like they can tolerate the drug and they'll probably be fine. So we could potentially use the drug for people like that. But that's not what the military did, right? Instead, the military said, here's your Mefloquine as you're getting on the plane, and you may have some crazy dreams, but suck it up, drive on. You got to use this drug to protect you from malaria, and you don't really have a choice. And so what we did was we systematically ignored and undermined the critical safety warnings in the product insert. And in fact, I think if you talk to most military physicians who have used this drug over the last quarter century, they may not even have been aware of these warnings in the drug label, or if they were aware of them, they probably thought, this is just written by lawyers, we can ignore this. But we should have known about this all along. And in fact, we did know about this all along. The drug company, and I believe the U.S. Army, did know about this all along, but they didn't advertise this. They didn't emphasize it. As a result, we've unintentionally poisoned a generation of veterans.
Is the failure from the drug company? Is a failure from the Army? Is a failure from the DOD as a whole?
So what you need to appreciate with this drug is Roche or any other pharmaceutical company would have never brought Mefloquine to market independently. Roche was the only pharmaceutical company approached by the U.S. Army in the 1970s that agreed to commercialize and develop this product. So Mefloquine was developed in a drug discovery effort that began in the 1960s, and it spanned 25 years.
Okay.
It was an extraordinarily long development process, and part of that was convincing a pharmaceutical company to market the drug. What Roche had to do to take this drug from the U.S. military's research labs and commercialize it was essentially invent a whole new area of medicine called travel medicine. Roche sponsored journals and organizations that would promote the use of this drug so that there was a viable commercial market that would guarantee the continued availability of Lariam for the military's use. The military needed Roche to develop a robust commercial market for this drug so that this wouldn't appear to be just a military drug.
Okay.
And remember, the military can't develop and market its own drugs. It needs commercial partners to do this. And Roche was always a very reluctant partner. And in fact, 10 years into the drug's availability, there's documentation to suggest that Roche actually went to the U.S. military and basically said, enough. Like, we don't want the risk of this drug. We want to discontinue it. And the military apparently made some sort of deal with Roche to continue using it, to continue buying it, to continue defending it against increasingly vociferous critics. And that's how we got into the situation we were in at the start of the post 9/11 wars, where Mefloquine continued to be used, often in very large numbers, such as at the start of the Iraq War. But if Roche had their way, they would have actually withdrawn the drug from the market, I think. The critical thing with Mefloquine is that it seems to be tolerated by a fair percentage of people. A fair percentage of people, as advocates of the drug will say, tolerate the drug just fine without any problems at all.
Yeah.
and that's great. That's good. But not everyone does. There's a sizable minority. And at first it was thought to be very small, but now we realize it's somewhere on the order of a quarter or a third or more of people that are susceptible to the drug's neurotoxicity. And the only warning, the only way we can tell these people apart is to give this drug, to give test doses of the drug. And if you develop nightmares or insomnia or any psychiatric symptoms, that's the indication that the drug is acting as a neurotoxicant in your case, and you must discontinue it. And the U.S. Army and Roche have known this all along. They've known this all along, and they haven't. They didn't properly inform service members or the public about this. We know today that mefloquine is neurotoxic. This is why the FDA and drug regulators around the world warn about potentially permanent effects, because it's known that this drug can damage the brainstem, it can damage individual neurons and cause death in the central nervous system. And it's this cell death, it's this neurotoxicity, death to brain cells that explains, we think, both the chronic neurologic and psychiatric effects. Even though drugs of this class were known to be neurotoxic, the military never did the kind of testing on mefloquine that it had done on earlier drugs of this class back in the World War II era. It's really tragic because we probably could have used the drug in a proportion of the force.
Yeah.
But it would have involved admitting the drug's inherent dangers. It would have involved saying, look, here's a drug. It's pretty good. We think maybe half to two-thirds of you will tolerate it reasonably well, and that's good for us because then we can get you in formation every week and give you one pill and protect you from malaria. The problem is the other third to half of you won't tolerate this drug, and it'll give you terrible dreams, and it'll make you anxious, and it might risk permanent brain damage. And the only way we know which of you can tolerate it and which can't is to just give you the drug. And we're just going to trust that you come to us as 17-year-old soldiers and tell us that you're having, wicked dreams or hallucinations, and then we'll switch you to another drug. So by the time the Army realized they had to do this, it was too late.
Yeah.
Right? They'd spent all this time developing the drug. They didn't want to admit the drug was a failure. Roche had been using the drug in certain markets for several years, and so to have withdrawn the drug then would have opened them up to extraordinary liability, because the question would have arisen, in 1989, why are you withdrawing this drug? It's been on the market in Europe for 4 or 5 years. Why are you withdrawing it now? Well, it's neurotoxic. It can cause permanent damage. Oh, that's not good. So what the Roche and the military did was essentially just double down on the lie that the drug was safe. They had no choice. The military had no choice but to do that, in their opinion, because the military felt they needed this drug, but they knew that the drug could not be marketed and would be a commercial disaster for Roche if they were honest about the drug's dangers.
What can you tell me kind of about the current VA landscape about this, kind of how the VA is handling any claims to mefloquine toxicity?
So there's been, to my knowledge, there's been no central guidance or formal guidance issued from VBA on this. And so regional offices, individual claims examiners can examine these cases individually on their merits based on the strength of the veteran's claim. And in fact, going back to the early 2000s, there have been claims awarded for disability attributed to mefloquine. Some of the earliest claims we think were from just the start of the post 9/11 wars. So there have probably been 2 or 3 dozen successful claims awarded where mefloquine has been explicitly acknowledged as the cause of a chronic neurologic or psychiatric disability. Those are cases that I'm aware of in my files, and there's probably many, many dozen more that I'm not aware of. And of course, it's very likely that a large number of claims for things like PTSD or mental illness or TBI-like symptoms are actually due to mefloquine, right? We don't know how many of those are actually due to mefloquine. They're service-connected, but we don't know. year ago, perhaps in response to this, to rising claims. The VA Office of Public Health commissioned the national academies to review the evidence and write a report on basically, is there evidence of chronic effects from mefloquine, which is odd. That strikes me as very odd because drug regulators have already said as much, right? Drug regulators in the United States and Canada and the European Union have said this drug can cause long-lasting psychiatric and chronic and permanent neurological problems. So the experts have already spoken. And the cynical part of me suspects that the VA is stalling for time or hoping that the national academies might take a little bit of air out of this balloon, and that they might be able to have a study that they can cite to deny veterans' claims. That's the cynical side of me speaking. But we'll see what the national academies concludes. I've been invited to speak to their meeting, and I've been very critical of the effort. I told them that that the existing literature on this is very biased. A lot of it is obviously sponsored by the original drug manufacturer and the VA and the military. It's not, these studies weren't designed to explore this particular hypothesis that the drug causes chronic symptoms. Our position, the nonprofit that we've set up, adopts the position that this drug, this class of drug, causes a disease. And this disease is marked by signs and symptoms that can very readily be misinterpreted and misdiagnosed as things like PTSD or TBI. So it's not surprising that we're not seeing a lot of people whose problems are being attributed to this drug in the literature, because these things will be misattributed to PTSD and TBI and so on. And there just haven't been studies done to try to disentangle this. But the basic science, the basic biology and neurotoxicology is very well developed. And there's no denying that this class of drug, mefloquine in particular, is neurotoxic. And so it stands to reason that we're going to be seeing chronic problems as a result of this. And the studies to define just how bad this problem is haven't been done. And I don't think the current literature can exclude the possibility of a sizable minority of people who've taken this drug being disabled.
What do you think needs to happen to kind of, amplify the drumbeat, if you will?
Yeah, so I think that there are many veterans out there who are actually suffering from mefloquine poisoning, but reviewing their medical records and talking to their clinicians, and even sometimes talking to the veterans, you would never know, because the problems caused by the drug are being so commonly misattributed to other symptoms or to other causes. And I think the solution to this is not more research. I don't think it's funding. I don't think any of that's necessary, Todd. Scientifically and medically, this is a very simple problem. This is not complicated. The drug is neurotoxic. We know what areas of the brain it damages. We know the signs and symptoms that you expect from that sort of damage.
Yeah.
And we really have it figured out. I've published a few papers where I basically describe this disease. What needs to happen now is we just need to start identifying this. And the way we do this is for clinicians on the front lines who are seeing veterans who've been exposed to this drug to simply ask the question, have you taken mefloquine? And then if the veteran says, well, actually, yeah, I do take mefloquine, to then ask the question, okay, look, during your use of the drug, did you have any problems? Did you have the dreams? Did you have the insomnia? Were you anxious, depressed, restless? The same questions that the drug manufacturer has been telling us all along we should be asking our patients, right? If you take this drug and you develop these symptoms, stop. Ask our veterans these questions. And then what I expect will happen is clinicians on the front line who've been seeing veterans with all sorts of weird conditions that don't really quite fit in with like PTSD, don't really quite match TBI. The clinicians themselves, I think, will start to realize, wait a second, all the patients I have with PTSD that's not getting better, or with anxiety but the memory problems, or really strange sleep apnea that I can't explain.
Mm-hmm.
It's these folks are the ones that are telling me they took mefloquine and they had symptoms during their their use of Mefloquine. And I think that's all it's going to take. I think that we have enough folks out there suffering from this that if the VA were to just mandate this type of screening, that the medical community will figure this out on their own. But I think that there are a lot of clinicians in the VA and the military that they might suspect this, but they're still under the impression that the VA and DoD don't want to acknowledge the problems caused by Mefloquine, that there might be some repercussions to them saying this person has Mefloquine poisoning. And so mandating this screening, simply mandating that the VA, during the clinical process, screen their veterans for Mefloquine exposure, I think that will be perceived as sending a green light to clinicians that want to speak about the dangers of Mefloquine, that want to attribute this problem to Mefloquine. And I think the studies will just sort of emerge naturally from that. It's a big problem, Todd. Like, there are a lot of people affected. It's probably thousands or tens of thousands of veterans who are affected to some degree by this. But this is an easy problem to solve. And it's a relatively small problem compared to some of the other big things that are affecting veterans. But the reason we haven't seen progress on this is because of how embarrassing this is going to really solve this problem. Like it's an easy medical and scientific problem, but politically it's hard. To make a bad pun, it's going to be a really bitter pill to swallow. For the VA and DoD to admit that they've poisoned a generation of veterans and that much of the PTSD and TBI epidemic is actually caused by this drug that they developed, in which they claimed for years was safe. And that's going to be very embarrassing for a lot of people, including some people that are still in positions of power who for many years have been inappropriately defending the drug.
Yeah, so that's a lot to unpack for people who have served and may, in fact, have been exposed to some of these or any other toxins. And I feel like this is a really appropriate place to note that DAV represents veterans at no cost to help them get the benefits and health care they need for those service-connected injuries and illness. So 2 of the questions that we get asked the most, first, how do I know if I should even file a claim? And then how do I go about doing that? So here to talk a little bit more about that is DAV's Mary Deaver and Assistant National Service Director John Retzer.
Hi, I'm Mary Deaver with DAV, and I'm here today with John Retzer, Assistant National Service Director for DAV. John, tell me a little bit about your experience in the military and what brought you to DAV.
So I served in the United States Army as an infantryman from 91 to 95, and then went over to the National Guard from 95 to 98. And I was actually medically discharged out of the National Guard. And then I came to DAV in 2003 and was a National Service Officer at the Fort Snelling, Minnesota Regional Office for 14 years prior to coming to Washington, D.C. here.
So you've been a benefits expert, a benefits counselor for about 16 years now. We're talking a lot today about toxic exposures from Agent Orange, burn pit, things that service members may or may not have been exposed to during their time in the military. Did you deal a lot with that, or is there any changes that you can see coming down the pipeline with veterans who need to file claims?
So from personal experience from the military, there was potential exposure to asbestos, for example, also JP fuel from jet propulsion fuels that are out there. Also being a Gulf War veteran, we knew that there was a risk of being exposed to certain hazards that were over in the Gulf and some of the other toxins that we may have been subjected through the medical needs that through vaccinations and such. However, in the claims world, what we have seen is our counterparts of Vietnam veterans were exposed to the Agent Orange herbicides, and those numbers are very greatly submitted through the Department of Veterans Affairs at this time. And what we anticipate is that our Gulf War veterans, in particular our post 9/11 Gulf War veterans, will see an uptake in injuries and illnesses in particular that will be the result of their exposure to different hazards like the burn pits.
So how do I know if I've been exposed? What do I need to be looking out for?
So I think to determine if you've been exposed is not really the concern. Knowing that you were serving overseas and potentially being exposed to certain types of hazards, or even in the lower 48, you may have been exposed to certain chemicals that were brought over there. When you have that question in mind, the first thing you probably want to do is reach out to a veteran service officer, and you can locate them through the benefitsquestions.org. Find your local office, talk to a national service service officer who can better facilitate the developmental needs of what can be filed and how you go about to develop that.
Well, and just to be clear on that website, I know that there's a hidden S in there. It's benefits questions.org, correct?
Yes, so we've got benefits with the S and questions with an S.org.
So benefitsquestions.org. And what can I do once I get there? What is that website going to tell me?
So when you go to that website, you'll go to that landing page that says find your local office. At that time, you'll see a picture of the United States, and you'll be able to put in your zip code to the left of that map. And as you do that, you will go ahead and search, and it'll find the National Service Office that is closest to your location. At that time, you'll be given not only the address and phone number, but the best tool is going to be the email address.
So you mentioned that I might not have even had to have served overseas in order to have been exposed. I may have been serving in the lower 48 or something like that. Should anybody who thinks that they may have been exposed, should they follow up on this?
Yes, anytime any individual feels that there is an injury and illness that they feel is related to service directly, aggravated by service, or presumptive by exposures, you want to bring that question forward to the Department of Veterans Affairs through your National Service Officers who can facilitate that. Because at any given time, you just don't know, and it's best to ask to find out if you're entitled to it. Because if you're not, they'll let you know, but if you are, they're going to grant.
Well, and I know especially whenever you talk about toxic exposures and different things that you were face-to-face with during your service, it might not affect you now, but it could affect you down the road.
Right, and as we've learned from our previous generation, our Vietnam veterans, a lot of our health concerns manifest themselves much later on in life because of the system of the body is being attacked, and it takes time for certain things to appear for us.
So what would you say to any veteran who thinks they may or may not have been exposed?
I'll tell you, at any given time, if you think that you have an illness or injury that needs to be identified or addressed, bring it up right away. I would not hesitate. One of the concerns that you have to deal with is not only the effective date of a claim, but it's the healthcare implications that you may need.
So it's better to get help now and beat it before waiting for way too long.
Stay ahead of it. You definitely want to make sure you stay ahead of it and get the assistance that you need through the claims process and the healthcare process.
Well, thank you so much, John.
All right, so hopefully that was some helpful information. Once again, if you need some help, go to DAV.org. That's where you can find all the resources available to get the help that you need. And with that, we've come to another finish line here on a podcast, episode 7 in the books. And Ashley, another great episode here. Plenty more ahead to talk about, plenty more things for us to do here this year.
Yeah, definitely. We're looking at putting together a show on women veterans and the efforts underway both at the VA and within Congress that DAV and some of our own DAV members are helping to support. Pretty exciting stuff happening there. Planning a show on alternative therapies, some of the new and different approaches to treating a variety of service-connected injuries and illnesses, which are showing a lot of promise and potential through research at the VA. And then as we mentioned before, 2020 is our centennial year. So big year for us as we turn 100 years old, and we've got lots of special celebrations planned as we mark that century of service to America's veterans. And you can always visit dav.org/centennial to learn a little bit more about what we've got planned.
Yeah, a lot of great things planned there. And while you're on the website, check out the podcast homepage, dav.org/podcast. That's where you can get all the episodes. You can also subscribe, as we said earlier, on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and Stitcher. Be sure to follow us on social media, too, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, LinkedIn as well. We're happy to be here, and we're happy to be back. Ashley, another fun time with you. I'm looking forward to plenty episodes ahead.
Absolutely.
For Ashley Burns and all of us here at DAV, I'm Dan Classens. We'll see you next time right here on the DAV Podcast.